Hello, everyone, and welcome to Learning to Advocate for Children and Families. I'm Isabella Mantilla, and I'm with the Brazelton Touchpoint Center, and I'm going to be helping behind the scenes here in this webinar today. As we all know, we have the fabulous Catriona McDonald joining us from Lynchpin Strategies in Washington, D.C. And she will be helping us tell our story for impact, helping advocate for policies in support of infants, children, and families. So that's going to be our amazing topic for the day. I welcome everyone, and please, if you haven't done so, present yourself in the chat. Everyone, I can see people are coming in from Massachusetts, from Illinois, from Rhode Island, from North Carolina. So many people from lots of places. If anyone needs Spanish translation today, we will be hosting this webinar in Spanish and English. In your webinar's controls, if you need to go to the Spanish channel, click interpretation and click the language that you would like to hear. We are offering it in Spanish as well. To only hear the interpreted language, click mute original audio so you don't hear both languages at the same time. We will also be offering closed captioning or live transcript. So in your room controls, click live transcript and click show subtitle. And to adjust the size of your subtitles, click subtitle settings. If you enable this, you can also click view full transcript to view the transcript on the side panel of the meeting. And if you have any questions or comments, please chat with us. You can see on your Zoom controls the chat feature, and you can ask any questions that you have on there and any questions that you have for our moderator today. And if you would just like to introduce yourself as well. And for any technical assistance, we have Nelson Artavia from BTC as well. He's behind the scenes helping make this fabulous webinar possible. So you can email him on the email on the screen and he will help get you settled. As you all know, we've been using Zoom for a while now. So everyone that's joining, please mute yourself when you're coming into the room. Make sure your name is displayed, and if you're dialing in through the phone, please identify your name in the chat box so we know who you are. And if you can, once we're having our webinar today, unmute yourself if you want to ask any questions, join by camera if you want to, and we will have a fabulous discussion today. We will also be having a survey that you need to complete to receive your certificate for participant in this webinar. The survey is available in both English and Spanish if you need it. It will pop up in your browser once this webinar ends, and we will also be sending out an email tomorrow afternoon where you can see the link and you will be able to submit that survey. And after submitting the survey, you will be taken to a web page where you will be able to download your certificate of attendance and saving it to your computer. You can even print it out if you need to. And we are also offering a digital badge that you can use for social media, and you can download and use it wherever you would like. The badge will be available for download once you complete the survey as well. It will also be available on that website where you can get your certificate of attendance, and we will also send it out in the email that we will be sending out tomorrow. And once you download that, you can use the badge as your profile on Facebook, on Twitter, on anything that you want, and let other people know that you are an advocate for children and families and that you attended this webinar. We have also created an advocacy reference guide to help any providers that are family-facing conduct their advocacy. It has a lot of helpful points and tips that can make it easier for you to reach out for your elected officials. It will be available for download once you complete that survey again, and via a link that we will send out in that email that we will be sending out tomorrow. And now to introduce our facilitator, we are joined by Catriona McDonald, founder and president of Linchpin Strategies in Washington, D.C. So Kat, if you want to join us, we can start our webinar today.
Isabella, thank you so much. And thank you to the whole team at Touchpoints for this opportunity for me to do what I really love and am passionate about, which is not just advocating for children and families, but supporting other people in doing their own advocacy for children and families. So Nelson's going to help me by advancing the slides, and we can go on to the next one. I have at this point spent 30 years, which seems like a really long time, advocating for children and families in Washington, D.C. And the first 6 years of that, I did that job working for members of Congress. As I shared on our webinar 2 weeks ago, while I was a congressional staff person, the number one question that people would ask me when they came from out of town to talk to me is, does this make a difference? When we reach out to our elected officials, does our advocacy actually make a difference? And I have to say, after 30 years of doing this work in Washington, my answer is still a resounding yes. So last time I shared a story about the Head Start Association organizing stroller brigades of moms with babies who traveled from Head Start centers to congressional offices all over the country and succeeded in saving $1 billion a year. And yeah, that's billion with a B, $1 billion a year for the Head Start program. Today, I'm going to tell you a story about one person whose story changed federal legislation. So Nelson, if you could take us to the next slide. So the Appropriations Committee in Congress is the committee that decides how much funding the vast majority of programs in the federal government receive. And it is the committee that gives money for childcare and Head Start and housing and food and nutrition programs and so many other things that our families depend on. And on this particular day, 2 people had come before the committee to testify about Job Corps, which is a residential job training program for out-of-school youth who need further development of their skills in order to be able to get a job. And the Job Corps program had 5 minutes to tell their story to the Appropriations Committee. So the first 2.5 minutes was given to a gentleman who worked for the Roto-Rooter company, which is a nationwide plumbing company, and he was the head of human resources. And he had a background that was very similar to most of the members who were listening to him, and he did a really good job of talking about the dire need that Roto-Rooter had for plumbers, and how, as the head of HR, it was hard to find the people with the skills to fill those jobs, and how lucky he felt to have a partnership with the Job Corps program so that kids could go to Job Corps, get their entry-level training in plumbing, and be hired by Roto-Rooter. And then it was time to hear from a Job Corps graduate. And I'm going to call him Taylor. And Taylor grew up in a very inner city, urban environment at a time not unlike right now, when violence was off the charts. And Taylor talked about feeling really hopeless as a young teen in his community. And he described to the committee at the age of 13, taking his entire life's savings and using them to buy a pair of white cotton pallbearer gloves. And the reason that he did that was because he had already carried the coffin for several friends at funerals. And when the preteens showed up at the funeral parlor, they only had adult-size gloves. And Taylor told the committee that he worried about those loose gloves slipping, and he didn't want to drop his friends. And so at the age of 13, he went to the store and bought pallbearer gloves. And he really didn't think that he, any more than his friends, had much hope for a future. And then when Taylor was 15, he had a son. And he decided that he needed to do something to turn his life around so that he could create better opportunities for his son than his parents, even though they worked very hard, had been able to create for him. And Taylor went to Job Corps, and he got his high school diploma, and he got an entry-level certification as a plumber. He got hired by Roto-Rooter, and he worked hard on his job, and he worked hard in additional training. And by the time he was testifying before Congress in his early 20s, he had worked his way up to being a master plumber. He had his own van, and he was training other plumbers to do the work that he had learned to do as a teenager. There was not a sound in the committee room as Taylor told this story. And at the end of that testimony, the members of Congress spontaneously stood up and applauded. And a few weeks later, when the budget came out for all of those important programs, they had added $50 million to the Job Corps budget. So this slide says that Taylor's story was a $50 million story, but we could also say it was a $50 million pair of pallbearer gloves, because that detail was so clear in the listeners' minds and so horrifying to all of the listeners that that story stuck, and it influenced the shape of legislation and the shape of the federal budget. So we're going to talk today about how do you build a story that can help you motivate members of Congress to take action on the things that you care about. Or maybe not members of Congress, maybe your targets are your state or your local elected officials. But how do you connect with elected officials with a story that helps to motivate them? So Nelson, if you could take us to the next slide. Obviously, a big part of this is framing the issue that you want to talk about and telling your story. So the first thing, the most important thing to remember, because it can be intimidating to talk to elected officials, especially if it feels like they come from a background that doesn't really resemble your own. Remember that you are the expert, and you know far more about the situation that you are talking about than they do. And they need the information and the perspective that you are providing in order to be able to do their jobs. Secondly, do a little bit of research on your audience. What does this elected official care about? What are the positions that he or she has taken on similar issues? And do any of them connect to the things that you want to talk about? Do you know people in common? Do you attend the same church or synagogue? Did you go to the same high school? Do your parents live in the community that this elected official grew up in? Or maybe you live in the community that they grew up in. Think about ways that you might be able to build a connection to the person that you're listening, that will be listening to you. And then think about a message that resonates. So certainly for me, in the story that I just told, this picture of a 13-year-old carrying coffins and worrying about his slippery gloves resonates for me, even though I have never been in that situation. But there may be some folks for whom the connection to the HR director who's struggling to find employees is a message that resonates. Think about the background of your listener and what information you might be able to provide that can connect. But at the end of the day, my experience is that painting a clear picture with details that allow your listener to put themselves, at least temporarily, in the place that you are in is the best way to connect and is the most motivating for the listener. Now, it can be a little bit of a challenge to figure out a way to do that and to do it quickly. As you're putting together your story, two things to keep in mind that are on the same slide. First of all, making a story compelling, it does not need to be long. Sorry, Nelson, if you can take us to the next slide. Your story doesn't have to be long. And in fact, if your story goes on too long, it can diminish the impact. But part of what makes that story compelling is details that are going to paint a really clear picture in the listener's mind. So that can be done if you are a master storyteller, which I don't claim to be. That can be done in very, very few words. And Nelson, if you can take us to the next slide, this is a famous short story by Ernest Hemingway. For sale, baby shoes, never worn. And in this story, we don't know what happened to that baby or that family, but we have a really clear picture that something is wrong, and our empathetic hearts go out to whoever it is that is putting those baby shoes up for sale. Now, we are not master storytellers on the level of Ernest Hemingway, but in my family, we have somebody who I actually do think is a master storyteller who did an excellent job of telling her own short story in a letter to her United States senators at the age of 4. So when you are a teacher or a doctor, it is very easy to explain to your young child what your job is. I have the disadvantage of being a lobbyist. And try explaining to your 3-year-old or your 4-year-old what your job entails. It's really hard. Well, one year, I thought I had a great opportunity to help my daughter understand what mommy does. When Kaylin was little, she loved sharks. I don't know why sharks were so appealing to her. She loved sharks. She knew all about sharks. She could tell you every detail of every species of shark. And one day, there was an article in the local newspaper about a group of survivors of shark attacks who had come to Capitol Hill to support a ban on shark finning. And shark finning is a pretty gruesome practice where fishermen capture sharks, cut their fins off because the fins are the most valuable part of the shark, and then throw the live disabled sharks back into the water where they're unable to swim and they drown. And my daughter thought that shark finning was about the most barbaric possible human activity. And in the article, the reporter was very intrigued that people who had been attacked by sharks had come to Capitol Hill to try to defend sharks. So I described this article to my daughter, and she wanted to know if she could advocate for sharks too. And I said, yes, absolutely. So I went to the computer and I'm going to share with you the letter that my daughter dictated, which is on the next slide. So Kaylin had me send an email to both of her United States senators. Dear Senator Warner, my name is Kaylin. I am 4 years old. Please take the people who cut fins off sharks and throw them back in the water to die and put them in jail. It is mean and cruel. Love, Kaylin, age 4. I love this letter because it makes the reader see what Kaylin saw. And can't you just imagine in your head the boat and people with knives and struggling sharks cutting the fins off and then throwing them back overboard? And also in this message, Kaylin made a very effective connection to her ask. She wanted them to go to because this practice is mean and cruel. So in this couple of lines from a 4-year-old, she painted a picture. She allowed the reader to see the picture that she had in her head in all of its terrible, gory details. She said, this is mean and cruel, and those people ought to go to jail. And I will tell you, we got a letter back from the United States senators that she emailed. And while senators' staff should be responding to all constituent email, I do think that the clarity of this message, and probably the fact that it came from a 4-year-old, contributed to the power of her message. So often when we think about advocacy, we start with the policy, the statistics, the facts and the figures. And there's no question that those facts and figures are important because we want elected officials to understand the scope of the problem and the meaningful number of people who are impacted by that problem so that they will be motivated to act. But sometimes it may be more effective to reverse the order. And instead of starting with the statistics and facts and figures, to start off with our story. So I'm going to tell you a true story. On the next slide, please, Nelson. And I would like you to put in the chat which of these two versions you think is most effective. So about 10 years ago, no, more than that, maybe 20 years ago, I served on the board of directors of a Head Start program for homeless kids. And part of my job was to talk to funders and ask for financial support for our Head Start program. And that's a different kind of lobbying, but it's still lobbying, right? It's still asking somebody to do something that you need to benefit yourself or to benefit other people. And the story that we would tell for our Head Start program was that it was the only Head Start program for homeless children in the city of Washington, D.C., and that there were thousands of children under the age of 5 who were homeless in Washington. And those children were often sleeping in cars. They were sleeping on couches. They were couch surfing from relative to friend to relative, whoever might put them up for a couple of nights with their parents. And if they were staying in shelters, and there weren't enough shelters for all of the homeless families at the time, if they were staying in shelters and they were lucky enough to get a bed, those shelters closed at 8 o'clock in the morning. And the children would be out on the street until the shelter opened again at 5 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon. And then after we had laid out that information, we would tell a story about one of our children and conclude by asking for money. One day, I was speaking to a group of employees from Macy's. So these were not the mucky mucks who were in charge of Macy's philanthropic contributions. These were employees who contributed to the philanthropic fund that was managed by the Macy's mucky mucks. And I decided almost accidentally to tell the story a different way. So one day, Jania's mom brought her to our Head Start program. Jania was almost a year old, and she had lived virtually her entire life in cars and shelters as a homeless child. And when she came to us at almost a year old, her mom was really worried because not only could Janiyah not walk, she couldn't stand and she couldn't crawl. And when we started asking questions, we discovered that Janiyah's mom was working so hard under really terrible circumstances to keep her baby clean and safe. Janiyah had never had a place where she could be down on the ground to move around. And Janiyah had spent most of her life strapped in a car seat or held in her mother's arms, or maybe lying on a cot in a shelter where the floor wasn't clean. We brought in physical therapists to help Janiyah. And it was not very long before Janiyah had developed the muscle strength that she needed to crawl and stand. And pretty soon she was the fastest moving toddler in the toddler classroom. We then went on to tell these employees that there are thousands of children and families like Janiyah and her mom. And the contributions that they made to this fund and to our Head Start program allowed us to help families like Janiyah and her mother. So here's a pause. Which version of the story is most effective? The one that starts with statistics, kids having to leave shelter in the middle of the day, the needs of families, and then a story about a child? Or the one that starts with the story of the family first and then goes on to tell the statistics? So Heather says in the chat, the one that starts with the family is the one that really grabs you. And I absolutely agree. Hooking people with the story first and then letting them know that there are thousands of other kids who aren't exactly like Janiyah, but are in the same situation, it's far more motivating, isn't it? And gosh, it makes the hair stand up on the back of my neck every time I think about and tell that story. So I want to point out a couple of other things that are in that story that are also important and part of an effective message and trying to connect with the listener. So one of the things that Head Starts and other programs that are working with socially and economically disadvantaged families face is sometimes there's a bias against those families. And people feel like if they just worked hard enough, they should be able to take care of their families. And oh my goodness, they might think a kid who couldn't crawl and stand and walk, and that's a bad parent. One of the things that this story allows us to send a message about is that Janiyah's mom was doing the very best she could to take care of her kids. And it helps to reduce any bias against these families and these parents because we believe that they need help. So we want to think about the message, think about the story, and are there some ways that we can build our story so that it does a good job of defeating some of those prejudices or the things that might be in the back of people's minds, at the same time that it is tapping into their empathy. The other thing that's wonderful about the story of Janiyah is that most people over a certain age have had children themselves. And that memory of the first time your baby rolls over, the first time your baby sits up without support, your baby's first steps, those are real milestone moments in any parent's life. And so talking about a baby who's missed those milestones also can help to make an empathetic connection. So there are lots of reasons why I think that story is effective. So we're going to spend a few minutes now, about 15 minutes, in a small group breakout. We're going to randomly assign folks to breakout rooms. And give you an opportunity to share the stories that you use. How do you personalize the issue that you want to work on? And we would invite you, if there are a couple of folks who are willing, to share a story that you use, or maybe if you haven't used a story, but as we're talking about this now, maybe there's a story that you're thinking about that you could use in the future. What story will you tell? How will you paint the picture? And what details will you include in the picture that you paint? Why? And what details will you leave out? Because maybe they're not necessary, maybe they're extraneous, maybe they bog the story down a little bit. So in a moment, you will be invited. This always makes me think of Harry Potter and disapparating. You will be invited to be whisked away to a small group breakout. Please accept the invitation unless you would like to be in a Spanish language breakout group. If you would like a Spanish language breakout group, please do not accept the invitation to go to another breakout group. Stay right here, and you will be right here for your discussion. We look forward to seeing you back here at about 12:46 so that we can continue our conversation. Welcome back. I hope that you had fun thinking about your story that you will tell with elected officials to help motivate them to do work on the things that you care about. I also hope that you enjoyed hearing some stories from other people in your group. For me, stories are both a tool that help me recruit others to the cause, but they're so reaffirming of why I do this work. And I hope that some of those stories were uplifting to you, as well as helpful to you in thinking about communicating with elected officials. So one last idea or suggestion before we move on. Once in a while, if you have enough time in your meeting and you know a little bit about the person you're speaking to, the most effective story can come from your audience, not from you. So, for example, my first job after college was as a middle school civic education teacher. And I really passionately believe that civic education is vitally important in a democracy as a tool to help people not only understand how government works, but empower people to engage with government and influence the decisions that government makes. So when I go talk to elected officials and staff on Capitol Hill about civic education and why civic education is important, I always start by asking a question. What got you engaged and wanting to come and work in a congressional office? Or what motivated you to want to run for elected office? And then almost always the answer to that question is that a young person had a really inspiring teacher. And it was that teacher and the things that that student learned in an American government class or a history class or in their civic education class that made them want to come to Capitol Hill or made them want to serve in elected office. And so they tell their own story and they are reminded of the importance of civic education. And then that connects them back to the office. And I don't have to tell the story at all. I just need to help them remember why they started doing this in the first place. We had another wonderful example of that a couple of weeks ago when I was with a group of home-based family, friend, and neighbor childcare providers. And we had a meeting by Zoom with a grandmother in Minnesota who is now a state legislator. But before going to the state legislature, that state legislator was a grandma with 7 kids who stayed home and took care of her grandchildren while her kids were at work. And this wonderful, smart, savvy grandmother talked about being a child care provider for her grandchildren, and talked about how when she was then elected to the Minnesota state government, one of her highest priorities was to introduce legislation to help support home-based childcare providers. And it was wonderful and exciting to hear her story. And she wanted to hear stories from people in the room as well, but it was her story that was the connection to the people in the room and to the issue. So Nelson, if you could take us to the next page, a couple of tips to remember as you're getting ready to tell your story, or maybe you're lucky enough to be able to ask your listener to share a story. But as you're getting ready to tell your story to an elected official, first of all, like that detail of the white pallbearer gloves in the first story that we shared, the details paint the picture. But you can put too many details in your story. You can make it too long. You can make it too cumbersome. So think about what details are helpful and when is too much of a good thing, really too much. You want to identify the problem. So homelessness in Washington, D.C. was the problem that we were trying to deal with in the story about Janiyah. We started with the story of Janiyah and her mom, but we did identify the problem. Too many homeless children in Washington with no place to go. Make your story short so that you don't lose your listeners' attention. Connect your story to your ask. And that was particularly well done in our big fish shark story. And last but not least, rehearse, practice. Your story might be quick and efficient and detailed in your head, but get in front of the mirror and say it out loud a couple of times, and you'll just smooth it out. You'll be less nervous sharing it, and it will be more impactful on the listener because it will be smoother in your delivery. So on the next slide, as you are preparing to make your case, think about who might be in this conversation with you. Maybe you're the one who is talking to your elected official and you're doing that alone, but maybe you are bringing other parents. Maybe you are bringing other advocates. Make a plan with your partners for your meeting or your conversation ahead of time. And I will say, when I am doing this with congressional offices, I always have a practice Zoom. And we get together and everybody talks about who is doing the introduction, who is making the ask, who is doing the conclusion. Are we going to start by going around and introducing ourselves? Who is going to make sure to say thank you at the end? So make a plan with your partners about your meeting. Who will do the introduction to the issue? Who is going to do the story that connects? Or maybe there will be a couple of stories, in which case you really want to make them short and impactful. Who is going to share those facts and figures and statistics? Because they might not be the place to start, but they are important. And who is going to make the ask? And everyone in your meeting should have a role, and your meeting should cover each of these 4 things. So thank you so much for spending, maybe it's your lunch hour with us. For a shout out to the Los Angeles and California, my home state and home city. You might be finishing your cup of coffee this morning. We're so glad that you joined us. So just a quick reminder on the next slide, we have one more in this webinar series, and we'd love to talk some more with you on November 15th at noon. We're going to be talking about how it can take a village, and how do you find and develop partnerships with other people in your community that would be allies in your cause. Sometimes they're unexpected allies and advocates that you might not think of when you're thinking of the traditional allies. And sometimes those unexpected allies can be among the most impactful advocates. So we'll be talking about our village of advocates for children and families, how to work with them, how to find them, how to prep on November 15th at noon. In the meantime, be well, and thank you for all that you do in your community for your children and families.